Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Welcome again, everyone. Good to see you. I am going to give what I think is going to be a relatively short and straightforward talk today because my energy is a bit low. And so I thought I would talk about concentration or immersion. And why is that a good topic for a short talk? Because I think it's very easy to overthink it, to get overly involved in thinking that somehow you can construct a state of concentration or a state of immersion of the mind. So, but there are some very specific instructions that we have been given in the Pali Nikayas. And so I want to go over that a bit. Can everybody hear me okay before I go any further? Great. Concentration. So, it's the word, the Pali word is samadhi, and it's part of the Noble Eightfold Path. It was actually described as one of the 8 most important factors on the path of practice. So it's not one that we should neglect. And yet I think for many people it's a bit challenging, or something that seems hard to approach, or something that is, I don't know what, troublesome. So it is the 8th of the Noble Eightfold Path. So we have right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and then right effort, right mindfulness, and then right concentration. Yeah, and you have to have mindfulness in order to have concentration. Those 2 things absolutely go together. Mindfulness meaning the ability to be fully present with phenomena in the moment, fully receptive to them in a non-judgmental way. And then concentration, or the other way to, a couple of other ways to translate this word samadhi would be absorption or immersion. I really like immersion because I think that that is very true to the experience of it, the kind of visceral experience of it. But concentration has become the word that is most commonly used, right concentration, right samadhi. And in the Samyutta Nikaya and the linked discourses, there's an entire chapter on the Eightfold Path, and sutra after sutra describing the Eightfold Path. That's chapter 45 of the linked discourses, the Samyutta Nikaya. So I'm going to share with you from the conveniently numbered 8, the 8th sutra from chapter 45 of Samyutta Nikaya, in which the Buddha specifically defines all of the 8 factors of the path. And I'm not going to go through all the factors. I'm just going to go through the final one, the right concentration. And so before I go into this, so I'm going to discuss this from the standpoint of jhanas, because that's how the Buddha defines it here. He defines it in terms of the 4 jhanas. Jhana is a Pali word that means these kinds of deep states of concentration, very, very absorbed or immersive states of concentration. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But before that, I want to say, even if you've never experienced jhana, or you, let's say theoretically, were never able to experience jhana, any degree of concentration on the path is helpful. Right? So learning about this and learning about what are the factors, what are the types of conditions that are supportive to these states of meditation is helpful, even if you maybe don't experience some of these very, very deep states. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share screen, and Claudia has this handout already. And I'm just going to walk through a little bit of, oops, now here, I thought I had it open. Hold on one second there, folks. Well, bear with me for 1 second. So those of you, some of you may have done the Committed Practitioners course with me, or the Approach to Nibbana course with me in the last couple of years. And we talked about this to some extent. Oh, there it is. I see it was just on a different tab. All right. Bear with me, everybody. Here we go. Yeah. So can everyone see that? Was that a yes? Sorry. Yes. Okay. Thank you. So this is the Buddha's, what we call some stock, what people tend to call stock language from the Pali Nikayas. And by that we mean language that is exactly repeated again and again in different sutras. And it's kind of interesting, that dynamic. So first of all, it means, for me anyway, the fact that we see this way of describing the jhanas in literally dozens of suttas means to me that it was relatively important information to be shared. And also, sometimes people tend to discount this kind of stock language, or they just sort of, I don't know, skip over it because it seems repetitive. But actually, my personal view is that that means it's the most likely to have been actually stated by the historical Buddha, because they are the things that were repeated again and again by him, so much so that the language became very fixed and very often used. So he would have been saying the same thing again and again, and therefore we see it in the suttas again and again in a way that's very clear. So looking at his description of the 4 stages of immersion of jhana, so he starts out with the preliminary, and this is important that we not skip over the preliminary: secluded from sensual pleasures and unwholesome states. Quite secluded from sensual pleasures and unwholesome states. So this might mean literally, in terms of like physically, you know, being out of an environment where there's a lot of music, or there's a lot of physical stimulation. It might mean that kind of thing. Or it might mean more figuratively, more mental seclusion. It definitely means that. And by that we mean like not dwelling on what's for lunch, or not dwelling on unwholesome states like anger, or bitterness or anxiety, things like that. So it means that you go to a place in your mind and in your body where you have a minimum of stimulation. So, and that doesn't mean that we have to find absolute quiet. I mean, if you think about it, the earliest Sangha and the Buddha himself, they were sitting outdoors and there were, the sound of leaves and birds and water and maybe a roaring tiger once in a while. So it doesn't have to be absolutely silent, but the idea is that you are intentionally turning away from stimulation. And then we have these factors. So there are said to be 5 factors of concentration, 5 factors of samadhi. So you have this word rapture is the way that is often translated that this, so the Pali words are in the brackets and the English words are next to them, just so you can understand what's here. Piti is the Pali word that's translated as rapture. I used to think that that was kind of exaggeration, but not really. Piti can be a very stimulating, it's a kind of pleasure that's very stimulating, a little hot sometimes, very uplifting. And then sukha, which is more calm. Sometimes here it's translated as pleasure, but sometimes I also translate as contentment. There's a kind of like nice hum, like, this is nice, like that. That's sukha. And born of seclusion, right, which we saw at the first, that was the preliminary, right? So having just taken that time to allow the mind and body to settle into a place of less stimulation, eventually the mind becomes happy, that it has less stuff to deal with. I know that that seems, that might seem counterintuitive. It might seem like it would be boring, but boredom is actually a type of aversion rather than a lack of stimulation. We always have these contacts happening. So it's more a matter of like more subtle contacts or more gross contacts. So due to the seclusion, due to the having the less stimulation, then eventually there is this very, very pleasant feeling that arises. And it's both physical and mental. So the PD tends to be the more physical of the two. Different teachers will tell you different things. And in fact, if you look at the commentaries, you see even like the same teacher say 2 different things about the same quality. So just know that it's both physical and mental, what's happening here. And then it's accompanied by, and this is the important part that I want to stress here. So it's accompanied by the vitakka. Vitakka, so the way to remember this, thanks to Gil Fronsdal, is tacking the mind onto your object. So the application of the mind onto the object. And vichara. So vichara, I think of it as carry. That's what chara means, actually, to walk with. So observation or examination of the thing, walking with it. So it's a sense of you place your mind on the object of meditation and you persist with it, you stay with it. Yeah. And so right here, you see immediately that the balance, the art of concentration is to achieve a sense of balance between total relaxation of the mind and body and minimizing the stimulation and being able to really stay with the object. And then what is the object? Well, there are 42 different possible objects. The most common one is the breath, the sensation of the breath. Very classically, the sensation of the breath felt just below the nostrils on the upper lip area. That's the kind of classical place. For some people that can get very tight. There's no reason to do it if it feels very constricted that way. There are other ways to feel the breath that are equally effective, in my view. Also, I highly recommend the Brahma Viharas. So the four divine abodes or heavenly abidings are also objects for concentration. And those, for me, I find, and for many people, they are very helpful because they immediately stimulate this pleasantness, this rapture and pleasure, this joy. They're very joyful states, right? So they are giving you a head start of already having that inherent joy and uplift to them. If you start with the breath, Ajahn Brahm, a very well-known and respected teacher out in Australia, likes to really hammer home the idea of finding the pleasantness of the breath as a way of helping you jumpstart the piti and the sukha, the rapture and the pleasure. So those four elements come together. And oftentimes, I would say the main stumbling block here at this stage is the tendency to sort of grab onto the object of attention. And that grasping creates a certain kind of tension in the mind. So if you can only stay with the object by grabbing onto it with your mind, by creating a certain kind of tension, then that will block the piti and sukha. That will make it hard for this other part to happen. Yeah. Or the other thing that often happens, and this used to happen to me actually, is that you start to feel the piti and the sukha, and then you get so excited that something's happening that you fall off the whole concentration thing and you lose track of your object. So that also happens. People get excited about the piti, and you kind of have to have it happen enough times that it's not so exciting. So you just keep at it, just keep practicing it, and that particular problem goes away quite easily. And then there is enters and remains. So one enters and remains in this state. And so what's happened so the difference between any other sort of concentration and the first state of jhana is that the mind has completely turned toward its own experience of the object. And this is a critical point. So let's say that you're using your breath as the object, and you're using this sensation under the nostril of the air flowing by. That is a physical sensation. That's a sensation of touch, actually, or it might be a sensation of heat and coolness. That's one way people experience it, as heat and coolness, or people experience it as a sensation of touch, like the rushing part of the air. But at some point, when you stay with it, then what happens is that the mind wants to turn from seeing that from the physical side, so to speak, seeing that from the touch organ, to seeing it from the mental side, the awareness that is receiving that information. So the mind is still with the object, but it's looking at the mental experience of the breath. Do you see the difference of what I'm saying? Versus the physical experience of the breath. And you'll notice, or at least I notice, that when that moment is happening, it sometimes feels like the mind is kind of pulling away a little bit from the object. And then it took a little while. This is also part of the art of it. Like, you don't want it to pull away and kind of get distracted and go into la la land. So if it's pulling away, the tendency would be to kind of keep it back here, right? To reapply your vitaka vichara, your application and your observation. But you need to let it do this shift. So if it's pulling away in order to turn inward, if it's pulling away in a way that leads to what feels like something a little deeper, a little more sharp, more clear, more focused, then you would go with it, let it go there. and the mind will turn in on itself. That's what we mean by immersion. It literally feels like the difference. Sometimes I tell people it feels like the difference between having your head outside of the bathtub and then putting your head under the water. That's the difference in perception of the object. There's a very sudden kind of shift like that, typically. And then I'll just move quickly through these next couple of ones. Then we have, so that's first jhana. And so we only have 4, you might have noticed, we only have 4 of the 5 factors of concentration or immersion here. Piti, sukha, piti, sukha, vitaka, vichara. Then we're going to go on to second jhana. So second jhana is a little bit different. And the difference is, I used to tell a friend of mine, it's like, suddenly this has a feeling of like an effortlessness to it. And why is that? It's because the vitaka and the vichara, the application and the observation, or the persisting with the object, the application and the persistence, they fall away. It says with the subsiding of those two, but staying with that internal calm, right? That little bit of feeling a little deeper that happened when the mind turned inward. Then there's this unification of the mind. It's called ekagata or ekodibhava. So bhava is the development of it, and ekagata is like the adjective, the thing, or maybe it's a noun, ekagata. Yeah. So yeah, it's a noun, unification, ekagata. So the unification, the mind starts to come together. It's not looking outward and grasping at other objects anymore. It's very content to just stay with the object that you're looking at. And it doesn't require a lot of effort because of this sense of contentment, continuous, this joy and rapture. So if anybody doesn't have their mic muted, please go ahead and do that now. So there's this, so that's the 5th factor, is ekagata, is the unification of the mind. And there's still this joy and contentment, and there's still this feeling of the mind coming together. And, sometimes I like to use here the metaphor of an octopus. So our normal mind and everyday non-concentrated mode is kind of like an octopus. It has all these little sticky tentacles, and it's going out and it's grabbing things. Oh, look, there's this and there's that. A shell, a stone, a shiny thing. A fish, let me eat that. Okay, yeah. But when the mind turns in on itself, it's like the octopus brings in all of its arms and curls up into a little ball, right? And then it's not doing all this grasping anymore. It's just contained. And then moving into 3rd jhana. So in 3rd jhana, the piti falls away. So this is a really nice state. It's called one who dwells happily. And why is that? Because even piti, even this joyful, uplifting, stimulating kind of joy, is too much at some point. The mind is just like, oh, I could even set that down. I could even relax another shade further and set down this joy. And I'm still feeling the sukha, I'm still feeling the contentment. But there is definitely this feeling of equanimity. And the mindfulness is very clear at this point, mindful and clearly comprehending. So it's like turning the lens into focus. Ah, right. It's very clear. There's very little stimulation. There's just this contentment. The mind is turned on itself. One enters and remains. One dwells happily in the third jhana. And then fourth jhana, now this is an interesting one because I will say that for myself, this jhana is definitely proof that there are practices which I cannot intend, but that do emerge with practice, with continuity of practice. And so even the sukha falls off, and this abandoning of pleasure and pain, it feels like what I said, sometimes a metaphor that I use or that I have spoken about in the past is it's almost like the window completely shuts, and then you're in this completely inner space. The mind was already still and only focused on one thing, but then it's almost like there's a whole nother layer of shutting down. In fact, one time I was in the middle of a sentence when this when this started to happen, but that was an earlier phase. You wouldn't be speaking by the time you got to third jhana even. There's very, very, very little wispy amounts of thoughts in first jhana. And then by third jhana, there are very, very few thoughts at all. But there is a point where there's like a closing of the window, and that there's a whole nother, like stepping into an inner world where the body isn't felt anymore. The six senses, the five sense organs are not really felt anymore. You don't hear anything or smell anything external or anything like that. There's no external world anymore. There's just the mind attending to the inner object, the mental experience of object. So that's why abandoning pleasure and pain, because if you don't have those bodily organs and you don't have the mind, and the mind has relinquished, let go of the stimulating joy and the contentment joy, then there's just this very, 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 very still state of mind. So this phrase here is translated two different ways. The phrase that the Buddha uses is translated two different ways. It's the purification of mindness by equanimity. That is a kind of active way of describing it. But I kind of prefer the second way, which is pure mindfulness and equanimity. Pure meaning not like I'd say pure in the sense that, again, the mind has allowed all the stimulation to drop away. So it's like when the water becomes very clear, right? There's no waves, there's no sand, there's no nothing. Clear to the bottom of the pool, as we say in Zen. So that's the description that has been given of the steps and stages of concentration. And just to circle all the way back to the beginning, so really finding the willingness, the interest in exploring concentration as part of your practice, finding the willingness and the time. So you're just by understanding even what the steps are, right? So that vichara, right? The observation or the ongoing examination of the object, that requires a degree of persistence. It requires you to be able to stay with your object over a period of time. And that is usually for most people, because some people are very talented right off the bat with this, but it's pretty rare. Most of us have to develop that as a skill over time. So it takes quite a lot of practice to just keep coming back and placing the mind gently, learning how to rest the mind on the object without creating tension, without grasping onto it, and staying with that, finding the joy in it, finding the pleasantness of it, and just allowing the mind and body to both relax, but also pay attention, be really, really present. And just working on that, it will naturally develop. It's not something that is the special domain of certain kinds of people or anything like that. I will say, however, that I believe that the reason why it's named eighth on the Eightfold Path is because the Buddha was very clear that ethics comes before any of this kind of mental development. If you're not living an ethical life, then the agitation in your mind will be very difficult to set down. There's kind of a very, very basic level of agitation that comes with making unskillful choices, right? So that's also why he begins by saying, setting down those unwholesome states. So, but there's definitely hope. If you haven't experienced it, and if you have experienced it, then wonderful. Then the next step, just to say that part before I close, is that this concentration is, although it's the eighth step mentioned on the path, the eighth part of the Noble Eightfold Path, is not the goal of the path, obviously, right? Concentration is simply one of the ways that we are training the mind. And once some degree of concentration has been developed, then what the Buddha said was, then you turn that very focused, very concentrated mind back to looking at the five aggregates, understanding how the mind and the body interact with your world, with your inner world and your outer world, and really studying that. Because once the mind is able to focus in that way, you'll be able to see that those phenomena, this life that you're living, you'll be able to see it in a much different way, a much more refined way. And maybe those frameworks of the five aggregates and the six sense bases and the 12-fold chain of dependent origination, they all start to make a little more sense. So that is my talk for today, and I hope that is of use to you and support for you.